because addiction, it's not a drug disease which strikes a small segment of the population. In fact, addiction is a very big part of life. I even want to say most people's lives are touched by addiction one way or another. And in that sense, it becomes a very important topic, particularly now. If you think about it now, I mean, what is the biggest addiction that we're facing? You could say it's fentanyl, and God knows fentanyl is bad enough and we're losing people, but I think we're seeing a lot more addiction to other things that are, in the long run, more life-threatening than fentanyl. And the extreme example to me would be addiction to power.
That's Bruce Alexander, and this is The Stories That Brought You Here, a podcast dedicated to learning about some of the people living in and around the Salish Sea. I'm your host, Chris Wakala. Well, we got a great episode for you today, ladies and gentlemen, because in this episode, we're going to be talking to a gentleman who has spent the majority of his life studying addiction. Bruce is a psychologist and conducted research on the psychology of addiction at Simon Fraser University, where he also taught between the years of 1970 and 2005. In this interview today, Bruce is going to speak about his experiences growing up that led him on the path to wanting to learn more about addiction. And he will explain some pivotal moments in his life that changed his perception about what addiction truly is. This is a really fascinating interview with a very fascinating person. You might also know Bruce Alexander from his famous Rat Park experiment, which he'll go into explaining a little further in this interview, along with a whole bunch of other things. All that and so much more in an amazing interview that's coming up in just a few minutes. But before we get started, I have a little story for you, and that is about my dad. When I was in my early teens, my dad began having health issues. As the next few years went by, those issues became more and more serious. And by the time I was 17, I think my dad realized that his life was going to be coming to an end soon. And in the summertime, I can remember the two of us, him laying on one couch, me laying on the other, watching daytime TV together. It was during those days that he tried to pass along stories of his life, and I, being a bored and somewhat self-absorbed teenager, I wasn't really able to hear the stories my dad was trying to tell me. I knew that he wanted to pass along information of his life, but I just wasn't really present or capable to hear it. He wound up dying less than a year later, and I don't really have a lot of regrets in my life, but that's one that's never gone away. There are little snippets and nuggets that I remember, like he always stood up for the underdog and how difficult life was as a logger, which is a profession he had for a period of time. But him being the youngest of 9 children and both of his parents passing away before I was born, I'm not really left with a lot of paternal family history. When I started this podcast in 2018, that was one of the many motivations for wanting to capture people's stories. As more and more episodes of this podcast came out in those early years, I began hearing from people on the island who were enjoying what I was doing, and they mentioned that they were lamenting the fact that they didn't have a recording of a now deceased loved one. I had many people tell me this, and it really resonated with me because I have the same story. So I got to work in figuring out how I could create audio memoirs for people. And in 2019, I launched that service. On and off since that time, it's something I've been doing, working with individuals privately to record their life story for their family members to have. And it's so important to me that just in the last few weeks, I've taken the plunge to go into this full time. So if you have ever wanted to record your own or a family member's life story, I have a website you can go to where you can find all the information you need, and it's myaudiomemoir.com. There you can find details about how the process works, and there is a link for that website in the show notes. And you can contact me if you have any questions, which I urge you to do. I'd be happy to let you know more and help you figure out how you can turn your own or a family member's story into a legacy. myaudiomemoir.com. All right. Thank you very much for listening to that. Now, here is my interview with Bruce Alexander.
I would love to tell you how I became interested in addiction. My mentors were Batman. You know Batman.
Yes.
He's a superhero, and my dad. So here I am, long ago, as a young person, and I'm reading a Batman comic. I think I'm about 12 years old, and Batman's doing what he does. Like, he's keeping his eye on the bad guys because they're going to rob the bank. So he's following the bad guys around. He's staying in the shadows. And the bad guys are planning. They're getting organized for the heist. And at some point, they run into a junkie. And for some reason, they get mad at the junkie. And they start beating him. And then one guy holds him, and the other guy punches him. And it's really horrible mayhem on the pages of the comic book. And Batman just keeps quiet. So they beat the junkie to a pulp, and they leave him, and then they go on and they plan the robbery, and they undertake the robbery, and then Batman swings out into the scene and arrests them and takes them to Commissioner Gordon, who's going to bring them to justice, and all is well in Gotham City. But I'm not feeling so good, because how come Batman let them beat up that junkie, and what's a junkie? So I asked my dad, and my dad says in his voice, well, Bruce, a junkie is a guy who doesn't care about anything but a drug, the drug heroin, and he'll do anything for that drug. And so there's nothing much left of him. His whole mind is taken up with the drug called heroin. And the reason Batman let them beat him up is, well, no one really cares about a junkie because there's no human being left to care about. So Batman just let him beat him up. And so I had to ask my father, who was always honest, but do you care if they beat up a junkie? And he said, well, Bruce, truth is I really don't, because there's nothing left there. And besides, he's got so much heroin in his veins that he's not feeling any pain anyway, so don't worry about it. That's what I learned about heroin, which was pretty much what everyone was learning about heroin in those days. We thought it was a drug. It grabbed people somehow by the brain once they took it, and they had no way of resisting it after that, and they ceased to be human beings. They were really somehow inhuman creatures. And so I believed that, and then I went to graduate school, eventually in psychology, and learned the same thing, only we learned it in psychological terms. We learned how it was that the drug could possibly have this effect on a human being, using psychological theory like reinforcement theory and stuff like that. Well, my dad was wrong, and Batman was wrong, and it took me decades to figure that out. And that was really the beginning of my professional life, which has been a life of studying addiction and trying to get addiction right, because that old understanding got us nowhere.
Okay, well, here we go. We're going to jump into the world of addiction and what you learned along the way and your career and your insights into this. When you say that your dad and Batman were wrong, what did you come across in your education that made you come to realize that?
There was nothing in my education which made me realize they were wrong, because my education all supported the same point of view. It really was kind of a universal point of view. I'm talking now about the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. Universal point of view is that there is this drug. You take this drug, it takes your soul away, really, and you're nothing but a drug user after that. Of course, you could go to some kind of treatment and it might work, but really you might as well just go to jail and stay there, because that's all there was to it, except that we as psychologists had to explain how that process worked. What was the link that enabled a drug like that? And there was a complex theory, which I will explain to you if you want me to. But it's not a very interesting theory, but it basically it's a theory of devil possession or demon possession, because the drug is a demon. It possesses the human being. The human being becomes less than a human being, and there's really no way out of it. Once a junkie, always a junkie. And that was pretty close to being a universal doctrine, and there was nothing in my professional training that made me doubt that.
And so if the education led you astray, at what point in your life experience did you start to recognize that maybe it was wrong?
Well, I had an amazing experience after I left the United States. I came to Vancouver, and Vancouver was one of the first places that was experimenting with methadone. Now, methadone is a drug which you could take as a replacement for heroin. And the idea is that if you get the junkie to take the methadone, he'll take the methadone instead of the heroin, and then he can live a normal life. Because the methadone, although it keeps the craving under control, does not make the junkie do horrible criminal things. That's the other thing about heroin, that not only does it take your mind away, it also inclines you to rob people and to beat people up and to rob banks and every other damn thing. But methadone doesn't do that. This was the theory at the time. So in Vancouver, there was the methadone clinic, and the young junkies would come in and they'd get their methadone, which you would drink. Of course, you wouldn't inject it. And then they would go out on the street and they would rob people and steal from the stores and use the money to buy heroin and inject it on top of the methadone. So the system wasn't working. It wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. So my job, with other people, I wasn't the only one doing this job. My job was to talk to the junkies and explain to them in a patient, professional way that they weren't supposed to go out and take the heroin on top of the methadone. They were supposed to just take the methadone and then go out and hunt for a job. And the wonderful advantage of this job, what made this job magical, is that I had no power over them. I couldn't say, okay, if you take heroin one more time, I'm cutting you off the methadone program. Other people could do that, but I couldn't. My job was as a psychologist just to talk sense into them. So I had no power. And that means they didn't have to lie to me. So if I had power, they'd say, oh, no, I didn't take any heroin. I didn't have any power. And so they would say, yeah, I took the heroin yesterday and I'll probably take it today. And they would explain to me what they were doing. In other words, when they left the heroin clinic, they weren't going out to look for a job. And they would say to me, they would mock that idea. What do you think, I should go out and be a janitor? No. I'm going to go out and hang out with the guys on the corner, and we're going to figure out how to take a store or get something out of somebody's car or hold up somebody and get their money. And then we're going to take that money and we're going to buy some heroin, and then we're going to sit around and tell each other big stories about how important we are and stuff like that. In other words, they were telling me why they were taking the heroin, and it wasn't because they didn't care about anything but the heroin. It was because they were part of a subculture. And part of the subculture was the word junkie. Like we of course, were instructed as professionals never to say junkie. We would say heroin user. They'd say, no, man, I'm a junkie. And what a junkie is someone who's got this needle in their hand, and they've got their arm stretched out in the vein right here, and they're going to jab that needle right into the vein. And the vein, of course, goes essentially right to the brain. And so they're essentially shooting heroin right into their brain, and they're going to have a rush. They're going to have an experience like, man, you never had this experience. I'm talking as they spoke.
Yeah.
Like, man, you square Johns never had that experience. I'm a square John. But that's what we do. We junkies, we just put it right in the vein. And there's skin poppers too. I'm not a skin popper, man. A skin popper just sticks it in the muscle, and they get a bit of an effect, but they don't get the rush. So we junkies, we have the rush. And they're telling me, in a way, that they've got a life. But they're also telling me, as I go on with them, because I get to see them every day, not necessarily every day, maybe every other day, but I get to see them regularly. They're telling me, well, they didn't have much of a life before that. Like they didn't do well in school. They dropped out of school. They didn't have a family that had any real future. They didn't have any particular interests, and they learned about junk. And the thing about junk is you could take a few dollars, you go down to the downtown east side in Vancouver, and you take your few dollars and you buy some junk on the corner, and you're in. You're part of the group. You're a junkie, and then you can hang around with these other junkies, and they're glad to have you. They like to have fresh guys to talk to and to hang out with, and then they teach you the ropes. Like, they had a whole subculture. And what they're really telling me is that, and I hate to say this, but Batman was full of shit. Batman didn't know a damn thing about that. And I hate to say it, neither did my dad. They didn't know a damn thing about what those people who were called junkies were doing. They thought that they were somehow a slave to a drug, but they weren't.
So through this firsthand account that you're having with these individuals, you're recognizing that they are finding community, they're finding status.
I'm recognizing that they are desperate people who don't really have a life, and they're finding community and status and belonging and purpose. We could go on with these kinds of words. They're finding meaning in this, and they have no other way to find it, because they're not the lucky kids who do well in school and, go on to have decent jobs and nice families. They're not those kids. They're the loser kids who find something and it's real, and they act as if they're desperate for this drug, but they're not. And what they're desperate for is to have a meaning in life. And the reason we know they're not desperate for the drug is from time to time there would be situations where the supply of the drug was cut off severely, so that the pushers on the street they're still selling the dope, they're still selling the powder, but it goes way down to just a fraction of 1% heroin. It's not heroin. There's just a dribble of heroin in it. They go right on doing it. They don't care. The placebo works just as well for them. Now they do have some withdrawal symptoms. They know what to do when they have withdrawal symptoms, which is they take a good belt of whiskey or a whole bottle of whiskey, and then they drink it down, and that'll control the withdrawal symptoms well enough. So what I discovered, and I wasn't the only one who ever discovered it, but this is just how I discovered it. What I discovered is that the whole Batman story is bullshit. What we have instead is people who are understandable people finding a solution to the problem of not having a life. They have a life. And it's not the life that their mom wanted for them when they were babies, of course. It's not the life that they wanted for themselves, but it's a life, and a life is one hell of a lot better than no life.
So once you came to the realization of this, and actually I'm just kind of curious about how long it took and how many conversations roughly it took for you to really kind of mull this over and make sense of this in your own head.
Well, it took maybe decades. Like at first I didn't believe them, and we would say, we counselors, because I wasn't the only counselor doing this, we'd say, well, they just keep telling us cops and robbers stories and drug stories. We don't want to hear that. We want them to talk about serious stuff like getting a job. And so at first I didn't believe them. And then I would go to my classes and I'd tell my classes, well, this is what they're saying to me. And the people in the classes, now we're talking about university students, the university students, half of them would say, yeah, they're telling you something real here. The other half would say, well, they're lying. Junkies always lie. There's the proof. Junkies never tell the truth. And so this led to a whole series of conversations and some experiments, because I'm a psychologist. In those days, that meant I had a colony of rats, and I could do experiments. So I did some experiments with this, and that's the way I settled it in my own mind was with the rat experiments, because the Batman story in those days was supported by rat research, and I had learned about this in graduate school. The rat research is you take a rat and you put him in a little box with a lever on the wall, and the lever is connected with a long tube that goes right into his jugular vein. So if the rat presses the lever on the wall, they get a little shot of heroin through their jugular vein. And rats do this. They just press and press and press, and sometimes they die of starvation because they're just so excited about pressing to get the hormone. There's the proof, right? There's the proof of the demon possession theory of heroin addiction. So we thought, well, maybe that experiment is wrong. Maybe that experiment is a result of the fact that you're taking a highly social animal. A rat is very social. That's why they form nests in your garage and raise little babies. They love to be social creatures.
God bless those rats. God bless those rats. Stay out of my basement, please.
Yeah, exactly. They're very social. You don't just find one rat in your basement. You find quite a few.
Yeah, definitely.
And so maybe that experiment is wrong. Maybe what we're doing is we're taking a highly social creature and we're putting it in solitary confinement forever. Like when they get out of the experimental box, they go back to their solitary confinement cage, and we're surprised to find that a creature in solitary confinement will take drugs. Well, people in solitary confinement will take drugs too. They do anything to relieve the oppression of being in solitary confinement. So we got some rats and put them in a situation where they weren't in solitary confinement. We put them in a big box and we called it Rat Park, and we gave them the opportunity to drink heroin in solution and just plain water. And we compared them to rats in solitary confinement. We gave them the same choice between drinking heroin in solution and water, and guess what? Well, it seems obvious now, but it wasn't obvious before we did it. The ones in solitary confinement drink a whole hell of a lot of the heroin, and the ones in the social situation drink relatively little. They don't drink none. And you can imagine that they may have some little parties from time to time where they drink some of it, and who knows, maybe they tell each other good stories like the junkies do, but they don't drink very much. And there's nothing that looks like addiction if you have rats that are not in solitary confinement. So the whole rat experimentation, which I had learned in graduate school at great length, is meaningless. So I went and told that to my students, that we have done these rat experiments now. That changed the student's mind, and actually I became a successful teacher, a successful university teacher, because students found that very, very interesting. And so then we were able to talk about, well, if the drug is not the cause of drug addiction, what is the cause of drug addiction? Not in rats, but in people. And so all of a sudden the whole vista opens up, and we can ask a whole series of different questions. And that's been my career. I've been doing that for decades, and I'm still doing it.
Well, let's just give the audience a little bit of a background story and framework as well, too. So when you mentioned that you're teaching at university, which university was this?
Simon Fraser in Vancouver.
Okay. And when did you begin teaching there?
1970.
The Rat Park experiment that I would say you're famous for. What year did that take place in?
Well, we did it several times, but throughout the 1970s, we did it and we repeated it, and it came out the same way every time.
And then when you first conducted that experiment, did you think the results that you got were the results that you were going to get, or were you actually surprised?
No, it was a genuine experiment. We didn't know what we would get, and we got what we got, and it was very clear. I guess I was surprised in the sense that it was as clear as it was.
So with that information going forward, what did you choose to do, knowing that the education you received, the story about junkies and addiction was wrong? How did you try to apply that knowledge in a real world setting?
Well, we formed a little organization with a very pompous title. It was called the Concerned Citizens Drug Study and Education Society. And the society, most of the members of that organization were junkies. And a few of them were, like me, university professors. And we started advocating for different kinds of treatment, like in the case of methadone. You know, methadone is a useful treatment because some people go on to methadone and they don't want heroin anymore, but other people go on to methadone and they do want heroin, but it relieves the pressure. They don't have to steal as much. They don't have to be as big criminals. So methadone is a very useful treatment, but so we advocated not throwing people off the methadone program if they took heroin, even though, we could continue to counsel them that they should try to not take heroin, but not throw them off the program because the program is helping them, even if they're taking heroin. It just reduces the pressure. And we did a lot of political work. So my wife and I moved to East Vancouver, not to the downtown east side, of course, but, to near to that area. And we did a lot of work with local agencies who were open to the idea that Batman was wrong, that these people still did have a soul. And there are wonderful agencies, couldn't go through the list of all the wonderful agencies, but there's all people who are doing all different things to try to help people who are addicted to drugs find some more meaning in some other way. For example, there's a wonderful theater organization that they put on plays, and the plays, they get heroin addicted or cocaine addicted or methamphetamine addicted to people to be in the plays. So they're helping these people to find a new career, to find a new way of organizing life. And that's real treatment. That matters. And some people do. They just leave the drugs behind after a while.
So what's the climate in Vancouver like in terms of public perception? I would imagine it was kind of an uphill battle.
Oh, it was such an uphill battle. And most people don't know that the Canadian history of the war on drugs, let's say, is really brutal. It's mostly forgotten now. But in the 70s and prior to that, all the way back to the 1920s, the Canadian laws were really strict and really brutal. So there was these big two prisons overlooking Vancouver. One is Ocala and the other was the BC Pen. Well, okay, that's out in New Westminster, but it's overlooking the urban scene. And these are full of junkies because junkies would spend most of their life in prison and they would be searched. Sometimes they were searched to death. If you can believe this, it seems unbelievable now, but this was absolutely true. It was legal to search somebody by having one cop stand behind him and put his hand across his throat like this, and the other cop punch him in the stomach repeatedly because he might have swallowed the evidence. He might have put the dope in a plastic wrapping and swallowed it when he saw the police. So they were allowed to do this. Well, unfortunately, people died when they did that, and the coroner's juries repeatedly ruled that this was justifiable homicide. It was not murder. It was simply a search that had gone wrong. It was a horror show. And those are just two particularly gruesome examples, but knocking down doors was routine. They would just go to people's houses and knock the door down, walk in with a writ of assistance, which is a legal paper which made it legal to do that, and then wreck everything because they were searching for dope. And if they didn't find any, well, it's too bad. You'll have to clean it up, I guess. It was a horror show. And the people who believed in that horror show were good people. You know, it wasn't that they were malicious. They were afraid. They were afraid that this disease of drug addiction would get their own children. And the way to prevent it from getting their own children was to get the people who were spreading the disease into the BC Penn or Ocala and keep them there forever. And many of the junkies spent most of their life in and out of those prisons. And of course, if a person was a dealer, they could get a life sentence right away, and then they were in forever. So it was horrible, and it continued that way. But over the years, the evidence prevailed. I mean, it wasn't that Rat Park prevailed, but other kinds of evidence, much more advanced and much more convincing than Rat Park, showed up to make it clear that addiction is not simply a demon possession, and that Batman was wrong, and my dad was wrong, unfortunately. But that whole process, I worked in doing that work from 1970 to 2005 when I retired, and then I wrote a couple of books which explain all this. And it wasn't just me. I'm not a superhero here, but there were lots of us who were doing this work, and the culture changed. So now we have other kinds of problems, and you know, the culture is still changing, and it's quite possible we've gone too far in the other direction. We just don't know. We don't know where we are. We haven't solved the problem yet, but we have established that stupid, brutal, cruel, futile war on drugs was absolutely wrong. It was a big mistake. And too bad, Batman.
You know, it's interesting when you said earlier about it's kind of hard to believe that actually happened in the past, where you'd have these people being searched to death. We had a conversation, you and I, just a few days ago when you told me that story, and I was just floored when you told me that the police doing a search were allowed to choke someone and punch them in the stomach, and sometimes resulting in death. Even later on that evening, I was telling my wife about it because I was so stunned that was a reality, and that was fine by the law. Anyway, it is shocking to think about. Something I wanted to ask you, though, is that in your quest to understand addiction, was it driven by a sense of compassion for other human beings? Because I'm kind of getting that. Because okay, here's the thing, right? Is that with drug use and with addiction that exists, is that you use the word fear. And obviously a lot of fear exists around that. We don't want our children to get addicted to drugs. You know, we don't want this to be in our neighborhood. This is bad. And then demonizing the individuals who are addicted. And it sounds like through these interactions that you had dealing with individuals at the methadone clinic, that I get the impression that you felt compassion and understanding for their plight that they were in, and realizing that this goes far beyond this narrative of a demon possession.
Yeah. Well, if you get to know someone pretty well, you just sort of automatically feel compassionate for them, and unless you've convinced yourself they're not really a person. If you've convinced themselves they're just a drug-seeking machine, and then you don't get to feel close to them. But once you realize that they're human beings, of course you feel compassionate, and of course I did. I'm not sure about my own motives. So compassion was definitely part of it, but another part of it was political, really. It was seeing that we were making a cultural mistake and wanting to be part of the change, wanting to be part of the very earnest group of people who were working very hard to get our culture back on track so we weren't abusing these people unnecessarily. And another part of it, of course, was wanting to publish papers and be a successful academic. And another part of it was wanting to go into classrooms and tell people this story, which would catch them by surprise, and they would be grateful. People are grateful to learn the truth if you tell it to them in a fair way. So it all worked for me on many levels, and it still does. So I've written a couple of books, and quite often, every week, let's say, I'm getting a letter from someone saying, your book is wonderful, and it's helped me to straighten out my own life, and wow. There's a lot of payoff in doing this kind of work.
That's amazing. Because I think sometimes we put things out into the world, creative pursuits, because obviously writing a book, even though it is nonfiction, is still, it's an act of creativity. To be able to get regular feedback from that work that you've done in the past is fantastic.
Oh, it is fantastic. And I'm lucky, right? I just stumbled into this career. I had no idea I was going to go in this direction. I thought I was going to be a rat scientist or a monkey scientist for my whole life, which is, that's okay too. But I gave up on the rat science and the monkey science because really people are people and rats are rats. And we need to understand this in terms of people. I learned pretty quick that if we're going to advance our knowledge about something like addiction, we really need to leave our rats behind and we learn a lot more by studying history or by studying sociology or just by studying human beings, just by riding the train, for example, across the continent and talking to people. We learn a lot about it, because addiction is not a drug disease which strikes a small segment of the population. In fact, addiction is a very big part of life, and it's a very big part of many people's life. I even want to say most people's lives are touched by addiction one way or another. And in that sense, it becomes a very important topic, particularly now. And I say particularly now because if you think about it now, I mean, what is the biggest addiction that we're facing? You could say it's fentanyl, and God knows fentanyl is bad enough and we're losing people. But I think we're seeing a lot more addiction to other things that are, in the long run, more life-threatening than fentanyl. And the extreme example to me would be addiction to power, because I think we're amidst of political chaos now. This is the year 2025, and we are seeing political chaos. And what we're seeing is a lot of people who are addicted, if I can use that word in this way, which is a correct use of the word. A lot of people are addicted to power maniacs, people like Donald Trump, who is himself a power maniac. Or if we look back in history, we could look back to the 1940s, 1930s, and we would see a lot of people in Europe addicted to Adolf Hitler, who was himself a power addict. I think these power addictions can be understood in exactly the same terms as drug addictions, except, of course, they involve a different set of people, except there's a huge overlap between the two sets of people, because many people who are involved in the power addiction side of it have histories of drug addiction. Not all, of course, but, the two kinds of addiction overlap quite a bit.
So when you say there's a power addiction for the people who are addicted to, I guess maybe like the persona, the ideology of Donald Trump, let's say, when you say there's an addiction, is it something similar along the lines of finding community, identity, status, connection through?
The positive part of it is if you're, let's say you're a MAGA person or MAGA person, well, you've got friends, right? There's lots of people who want to be on your side and talk to you. Of course, you've got enemies too, and you've got to be harsh with those enemies because they're real enemies. And You may not have time for your family. There are groups, just like there are AA recovery groups for alcoholism and for narcotic drugs, there are recovery groups for power addicts of this sort. And there are people who say, "Oh, I realized I was throwing my life away by being such a fanatic follower of Donald Trump or whoever it happened to be, and I'm stopping. I'm quitting that. I'm getting out of that." So everything is parallel, and this set of parallels. So this is why I write books. I write books about these parallels. It's absolutely clear. If you get the Oxford English Dictionary, which is like the Supreme Court of dictionaries, and look up the word addiction, you'll see that to talk about a power addict is to use the word addiction absolutely correctly. This is the way it's used in the English language, let's say by Shakespeare or in the King James Bible. The word addiction means exactly what I'm saying it means. It's not restricted to drugs. So that changes everything, right? We can talk about addiction as a drug problem, which it is. It absolutely is a drug problem. But it's much more. It has a role in society, and in many cases a pretty dangerous role that we're not yet focusing on clearly enough. So I figure my professional life is not quite over. I'm not going to write another book, but I'm going to continue watching the field. I'm retired, right? I'm 85 years old. I don't have to do anything, but I'm watching the field develop. I'm watching this understanding of the role of addiction in contemporary culture evolve as it is. And I think it may be one of the key ideas in getting us out of the mess that we're in. I hope it is.
Well, let's just take a little segue here. And you mentioned the word parallels, and you mentioned earlier that when you came to Vancouver, and there was a subject I wanted to touch on with you, and that's what your life was like before you came to Vancouver. So going back to the 60s here, where were you living, and what was your experience, and what was the impetus for wanting to come to Canada?
Well, I'm suppose a typical American child of my generation. My generation was born before World War II, so I grew up during World War II, and I was 5 when World War II ended. And this was the high point of American power and glory in the world. The United States was the country which had gone through World War II without being bombed and destroyed, but had been on the winning side and had contributed in a major way to the winning side, and it contributed largely by its economic contribution. In other words, the United States was the arsenal of democracy. It really was. It was manufacturing the tanks and the artillery and everything that won the war. And as a consequence, at the end of World War II, the United States was not only intact, it was rich. Half the world's gold was in Fort Knox. And the United States was the leader of, so-called the leader of the free world, as we said in those days, which meant that the United Nations was established right after World War II in my hometown, which was New York City. And we were going to lead the world to sanity. And wow, I mean, this is pretty heady stuff for a child to grow up with. And I loved being in that position until, I got a little older and I saw other things that happened, like the great civil rights struggles and the Vietnam War. And I realized that the United States was really unable to fulfill that promise that it had before it at the end of World War II. It couldn't fulfill the promise. It just wasn't smart enough. I mean, I don't know if another country could have risen to the occasion or not, but the United States didn't, unfortunately. And so there was the Vietnam War, and there was all these failures and all these demonstrations that the United States really was just another imperial power now, and it was invading Guatemala and various South American countries, and it was and Vietnam, of course, and Southeast Asia, it had turned from a glorious promise to a sort of tragic downfall by the late 1960s, and after the 1968 election, I knew I had to leave. And I wasn't a draft dodger, although the Vietnam War was still going on and people were being drafted. I just couldn't stomach it. And I was working in a government laboratory doing animal research, of course. And I realized that even in the laboratory, things were not what they seemed to be. Like I realized I was getting instructions about what I could and what I could not discover in my experiments. And I didn't want those instructions. I thought, wow, I'm a scientist. I get to decide what I can discover.
What do you mean you were instructed as to what you could or could not discover?
Well, I could give you specific examples. One of the researchers that was done in the laboratory where I worked, this wasn't my own research, but it was injecting pregnant females with testosterone close to the time when they gave birth. Now we're talking about monkeys. And what happens when you do that is that you masculinize the female offspring. In other words, they come out with male genitalia and they come out acting like males. And they really do act like males. And then, so one of the conclusions of that kind of research is that there really is a structural difference between a male brain and a female brain, and that you can sort of deceive the system, which normally makes a male come out acting like a male and a female acting like a female, and you can reverse it so that the female comes out acting like a male. And you can reverse it in the other direction too, but it's more complicated how you do that. But we got the message, well, we're not supposed to discover that there's a difference between male and female brains. And it wasn't saying, no, the research is wrong. It was just saying, well, this is really not something you should be discovering. And because it wasn't right for the times. And that research has gone on, and it's a controversial topic. I mean, it may be that there isn't a difference between male and female brains. I'm not saying, I don't want to fight that battle. There is research on both sides of it, but we were in good faith conducting research on one side of it, and we were getting one kinds of answers. Other people were getting other kinds of answers, but we were getting the message from the laboratory that we're not supposed to do that kind of research and get that kind of answer. So we had to stop. Well, that's what I mean.
Okay. Just to be clear, you said that the injection of the testosterone would change the genitalia of the
female offspring.
Wow, really? Okay.
So here's what happens normally. During pregnancy, the male testis develops during the pregnancy and starts producing testosterone before birth, so that the male child is masculinized by testosterone, which comes from the male child. Female child, of course, is not masculinized by that, but if you artificially introduce the testosterone into the pregnant female, then the female is masculinized in the same way that the male is masculinized. And this research has stood up. I mean, this fact itself is true. Now, whether that's true that this proves that the male brain is different than a female brain is still controversial. There's evidence on both sides of that. But the research itself is correct. But it wasn't acceptable. And that's what I mean when I say that, the United States, I'm kind of an anti-American. I have to confess this, because I think it is the fact that in the United States, everything is not what it seems to be. A lot of things are kind of predetermined for reasons which are mysterious. They're built into the system, and we don't know why, but we just know we're not allowed to discover these things. So that was another part of the reason for me to leave the States, in addition to the just the disappointment in the political process, because there were so many people. There were so many people who I knew and trusted and cared about, who were out on the streets often, including me, trying to stop this damn war, this murderous Vietnamese war. But neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party would get involved in that. The war was going to continue, and it did continue for quite a few years after that. And I couldn't be part of that. I felt, and it was for personal reasons. It was because I thought I would go crazy.
You know, it's so difficult for me to imagine what that must have felt like, because when I hear stories from people and I see images about the size of protests and the frequency of them and the passion behind many individuals in the States about wanting to stop the war, it seems from a perspective from the future that I have is that, wow, that's a lot of energy being directed towards trying to influence the situation. And it didn't seem to really help. And that's the message I get from individuals like yourself who I've spoken to over the years who were just disillusioned about not really being able to affect a change in trying to stop this war that had been raging for years.
Oh, it was amazing. Like, I did a lot of work, volunteer work, knocking on doors. I would knock on doors, say, hello, I'm part of the McCarthy for President Committee in Washington County, which is where I live, Washington County, Oregon. And I want to tell you why we're opposed to the Vietnam War. And then I would explain. And people would listen and they'd say, oh my God, I never heard any of that. And I'm not sure how many people's mind I changed, but I know that people were willing to listen and that the country was ripe for turning away from its imperial manifest destiny, which it's continued to pursue. It was ripe to mature as a country and turn away from that. But neither the Democrats nor the Republicans were going to help. And I thought I would lose that. I thought I would go crazy. And I had to leave. Unfortunately, my wife wouldn't leave, and I left behind my wife and 2 children. And fortunately, I'm still in close touch with my 2 children and my ex-wife. And that family is not completely ruptured, but it was sure ruptured at the time. And that was a horrible time for me. But then I came to Vancouver, and I lucked into this appointment at the methadone treatment clinic. And all of a sudden I had a new career, and it was interesting. And nobody ever told me, like lots of people told me they didn't believe what I was finding with my rats or with my historical research, but nobody ever told me I shouldn't do it. They just said, well, we think you're wrong. But a lot of people said they thought I was right. So I think the intellectual climate in Canada is distinctly different from the intellectual climate in the United States at that time. And the intellectual climate on Pender Island is even better. So that's why I'm very glad that you've invited me to talk about why I wound up on Pender Island, because it's been a long journey.
Yeah. So the sense of feeling dissatisfaction and all the other feelings you had about being in the United States was so strong that it pulled you away from your family to move to Canada. What did Canada symbolize to you in those days in terms of like a refuge? What was it that you were hoping to discover in Canada that you couldn't find in the States?
Well, I mean, the main thing was that Pierre Trudeau simply wouldn't go along with the Vietnam War. He wouldn't support it. That was number one and prominent. Number two was that there was this university, which was sort of a radical university. It was Simon Fraser, which had just opened in 1965. And I got there in 1970, so it was still in the honeymoon phase, and it was about free thinking, and I was very glad to go there. And they've been very good to me. But what I didn't know was the subtler differences in intellectual climate, the fact that it really is possible to think in Canada in a way it's not possible to think very, very well in the United States because there are so many constraints and so many threats, like what's going on at Harvard University right now. We have no history of that in Canada, thank God, and I'm sure we won't. But that's incredible. There is a very different intellectual climate, and I know which side I'm on.
Well, I'm unaware of what's going on at Harvard University right now.
Harvard University is now facing a $9 billion cut in its funding because the Trump administration has accused it of being anti-Semitic and being overwhelmed by diversity initiatives. Now, this is absolutely ridiculous because anyone who, if you're having knowledge of American academics, you would know that Harvard University is the home of some of the greatest Jewish American intellectuals. There's nothing anti-Semitic about Harvard University. And of course, it has many famous Jewish graduates and everything. That to accuse Harvard University of being anti-Semitic is like saying Canada will be the 51st state. It just doesn't work. It's nonsense. And yet this is happening. And so Harvard University happens to have a $50 billion endowment fund in the bank, but they're getting something in excess of $9 billion a year from the federal government because it costs a lot of money to run a very high-class research institute. These are
clearly $9 billion. Wow.
That's right. But but that may all be cut this year. And if it is, Harvard University could only last about 5 years on their endowment if they cease getting there, and then it would have to close. And this is literally the case today, this day. Well, this is an example of a country which clearly has a different intellectual climate than Canada.
Well, you were mentioning earlier about the free thinking that was abundant at SFU. And so could we talk a little bit about that in terms of what that situation was like at that university during those years?
Well, I can talk about it mostly in terms of my personal experience.
Yeah.
Which was, as I mentioned, but let me expand a little bit. Like I started doing this radical research on drug addiction, which almost everybody disagreed with. Now, and I'm not claiming that I was the only one who did the research. I was not a Batman. I was not a single-handed superhero here. There were other people doing it in other places. But most people everywhere thought it was wrong. And they would tell me, I think your research is wrong. Will you come to our department and give a seminar on it? All in one breath, because they thought it was wrong, but they wanted to hear it. And they weren't accusing me of doing bad research. They were just saying the conclusions I was reaching were bad. Well, I like that kind of a university, and I like it when, I go to somebody's department and they rake me over the coals. They say, well, you've got to be wrong for this and this and this and this reason. And I say, yes, tell me about that, and then I'll tell you my answer. By the way, Harvard University did the same thing. The Harvard Medical School called me up, and they said, look, we think you're wrong. Will you come and speak to our medical school? Yes, I will go to speak to the Harvard Medical School, and they will give me a hard time, and fine. But that university would be closed, may well be closed by the time this podcast becomes available. It may be closed. So that's Canada, and that's the United States intellectually, in my experience. And other people at Simon Fraser University have other stories to tell which are similar. Now, some people at Simon Fraser University were eventually fired for being too radical. And I don't know if that was right or wrong. obviously there are limits, but and I don't know whether the university went wrong or not, but at least it was going in the right direction. It was going in a very, very free direction.
When you're bringing up a scenario of being invited to speak about something that people are openly telling you we think is wrong, but we want to hear what you have to say, to me, that seems like something that's missing in our society at the moment. It's almost as if people are very reactionary and don't want to hear more about what someone has to say that stands in opposition to their entrenched beliefs.
Well, it depends where you are in society. I think what you're saying makes sense to me because like in a political level, like we're in an era where free speech is really being constrained. And I think we have seen some examples of that in the recent debates, the leadership debates before the election, the leaders' debates before the current election in Canada. I think there may have been some curtailing of free speech there, like the Greens didn't get to speak in the leaders' debate. On the other hand, if you were in a Canadian university or a European university now, I think you will find the same emphasis on free speech that there was when I first came to Vancouver at Simon Fraser University. I think that's what I cherish about the academic environment, is that people will tell you you're full of shit, and then they want to hear your answer, and you will have that debate, and then out of that debate will come whatever comes. Maybe you'll still be on the opposite sides when the debate is over, but maybe not. But it's a real debate, and people can really present ideas. I think that culture still exists. I know it in the academic world, and I know it, let's say, on Pender Island. I know it in the Socrates Cafe, which is a very humble organization on Pender Island, and we get together and we disagree with each other, and we have a good time disagreeing with each other, and so it's still there. It's just that there's this other thing, this bashing culture that exists somehow on the internet primarily, is where I see it, and in the political world where people just call each other names, and there's nothing. That's not a debate. That's just wasting time.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly is a sad scenario where the criticizing of individuals online is so acceptable, it seems like, and that, the in-person conversations that you're describing about being invited to go places and hearing opposing thoughts to what other people have, and then a in-person debate ensues, sounds really healthy, and sounds, when you have that experience of like good back and forth.
Yeah. And it's not gone. It's not gone. It's just, it's not being publicized as the bashing, the competitive bashing is being publicized.
Right. Well, I think it's just what we're used to. I think that so many of us spend a significant amount of time online, and this is what we digest when we're scrolling. We see how people are communicating rather terribly with each other in some circumstances, and it does not seem healthy. I wanted to ask you something, because when you were referencing speaking to people while being on a train.
Yeah.
And I think I know what you meant by that, but I'd like other people to know what you meant by that.
A train is a wonderful place for a psychologist because they won't serve you in the dining car until your table is full. And if you're on the train by yourself or just with your wife, that means there's 4 people at a table. You're always having dinner with strangers. And you're having breakfast with strangers, and you're having lunch with strangers, because you can't get served until someone sits down in those other 2 seats. And it's also a wonderful place for a psychologist because people have got no place to go. And so if you ask an interesting question, if you haven't done this, you will enjoy the transcontinental train. Have you done it?
I have not. No.
You'll love it, because you just sit at this table and you ask an interesting question. and people want to tell you the answer, and pretty soon the meal is over and all the other tables are empty and they're still telling you the answer. And then you'll meet them later in the day in the club car or whatever, just walking through the train. And they'll say, hey, I didn't quite finish telling you what I wanted to tell you because there's time, and the people who travel on the train they got time to think about stuff. And, it's not like, oh, I got to get home. It's time to feed the cats or something like that. No, that doesn't happen on the train. And so I love to go to the train, and I used to go every year to my family's solstice party in Massachusetts, which is a continent away from here. And I'd go on the train, and I'd always arrive with some wonderful stories that people had told me on the train. And I highly recommend it for, I was thinking if a person were, as you are, in the business of doing interviews, you could get on the train and you could say to someone, look, when we get off the train, I'll give you a little recording and it'll be you. And people will agree to that because everyone loves to talk.
Oh, yeah. Everybody does like to talk. When you say ask an interesting question, what are some examples of interesting questions?
Well, one of the most interesting one was there was a book that came out called Methland, and it was about methamphetamine addiction. And it was making the point that the American states, now this is an American train, it goes through from Seattle to Boston. The American states can be divided into two groups. They're those who touch the salt water around the edge, the peripheral states, and there's the central states. And the methamphetamine addiction epidemic of the 1980s or 90s was primarily in the central states. And so I was taking a train trip through Methland, according to this book. And I would tell people that, according to this book, we're now in Methland, and can you see something about your state that helps you to understand why there would be a methamphetamine addiction in these interior states? And people loved that question. They would disagree with it or they would agree with it, and they would tell me wonderful stories. So I wrote an article about it called "A Train Trip Through Methland," and people like to read it.
So that's so great to get the on the ground perspective from the individual.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so were you hearing stories changing your mind about what you were reading in the book yourself?
It was generally affirming the book. I mean, the book is primarily about agriculture, and it's saying agriculture is being so industrialized now that a lot of people who used to be family farmers, they'd just have the farm up the road. Well, no, now they don't have the farm up the road anymore. They're working on somebody else's farm. They're really paid laborers, and they don't really have the same attachment to the land or to their neighborhood that they did when they were in the good old days when it was primarily family farms. And the consequence of that is, again, it's not having much meaning in life, not having much purpose in life, and so if they can buy some methamphetamine, which somebody down the road makes in their garage, they might buy it, and they might find themselves part of the meth culture, which is guys get together and they do crazy stuff, and sometimes it turns out to have reckless consequences or dangerous consequences, the reckless behavior. And they would say that kind of makes sense. And that was the thesis of this book.
Well, getting back to the grand topic of addiction here, which is obviously just a huge part of your career.
Yeah.
Is there anything that has happened along the way since those years at SFU, maybe in retirement, that has kind of been a new addition to your perception? We talked about how the addiction to power seems as if it's incredibly significant today. Maybe if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Sure. And there's another thing, too. I'd like to talk a little bit about indigenous history because that's relevant to your question as well. But first, let me talk about QAnon. Have you heard of it?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay. QAnon people have this crazy belief that the political establishment is really a front for trafficking in children, for pedophiles. Well, this is a crazy belief. I mean, it's bad enough. There's plenty enough corruption, but that goes beyond any conceivable reality. But they believe it, and it gives them an enormous sense of power because now they are the enemies of this massive ring of pedophiles headed by the Democratic Party, and they're going to do what they can. So there's a power addiction. Let's say a cult, and a cult which is based on power over political opponents. But in addition to the cult, there's a society of QAnon dropouts. QAnon, I think it's called QAnonymous. And they're saying, look, we used to believe this stuff, but it's obviously crazy. And it destroyed our relationships with our spouses and our children because we just wouldn't shut up about it. And they just didn't want to hear it. And it destroyed our friendships with lots of other people because they thought we were maniacs, and we were. And so now these people are helping each other recover. And if you Google QAnon, you'll find these associations of QAnon survivors, let's say. And so there's the proof. There's the proof of addiction to power, and that's something I didn't know. And of course, when we were doing this research on drug addiction. But the other thing I didn't know was that the history of colonization of British Columbia is a huge natural experiment in addiction. We have the unique advantage here that the colonization happened relatively late, like most of it happened in the 19th century. Or the 20th. Well, the 20th century was still happening, yes, but mostly in the 19th century. And that means that the colonists and the anthropologists arrived at more or less the same time. So we have really, really good information on what tribal life was like in British Columbia. And of course, the anthropologists know to rely on oral history, so they find out what life was like before the 19th century in these tribal groups. And these tribal groups are fascinating. Like, in one way, they're not that different than the colonists. Like, they had all the problem that the colonists did. They had marital infidelity, and they had insanity, and they had war, and they had torture, and they had slavery. They had all the problems of human beings, but they didn't have addiction. And I've tried to verify this myself. I've gone to I've visited a lot of native villages, and I always ask the question, what's the history of addiction in this village? And I don't mean addiction to alcohol necessarily, but addiction to anything. And they understand the question, and they always give me the same answer, which is, well, I don't know, but I'll go ask my grandfather. And they go and ask their grandfather, and their grandfather says, well, really, we didn't have much problem of addiction in this village until the colonists came and they took away our natural hunting grounds, and they didn't let us go out and catch whales anymore. And they really essentially confined us to reserves. Then the problem of addiction came up, and then we get this situation where in these villages where they have no history of addiction, all of a sudden they have 100% alcoholism. And when I say that, I mean that every adult is either alcoholic or they're on the wagon, which is like being alcoholic too. It's, you're still addicted, you're just controlling it. So here we have a natural experiment And it turns out this natural experiment is repeated all over the world, that tribal people basically have very, very little naturally occurring addiction until their cultures get truncated. Their cultures get confined in such a way that it doesn't really function as a culture anymore. Like, for example, they can't have their potlatches anymore, which are major, major cultural events, and they can't have their native religion anymore because their kids have got to go to residential school and learn to be Catholics. Their culture is gone. Their culture is stripped from them, and addiction comes in, and as far as I can see, essentially takes its place, because people who can't have a culture to give their life meaning can always go to the bar in the evening and tell each other a bunch of bullshit stories and get good and drunk, and then go home and slap their wives around. It's something. It's better than being just a stupid, good-for-nothing Indian. And we have that history here in spades. And you can read about that history all over the world. It takes that form all over the world. And of course, we justify it here. We say, well, that Indians just can't handle alcohol, which is nonsense. The reason we know it's nonsense is because in other places, the natives already had alcohol. When the white man colonists came, they already had alcohol, and they used it, and they would have parties, and they would have drunken events where everyone got drunk, and they would have, most of the time, they would just live a nice, sober life. They knew how to domesticate alcohol, just like most of us know how to domesticate alcohol. So we use it sensibly. Doesn't mean we don't drink necessarily. It means we drink sensibly if we drink. They know how to do all that. But when they get colonized, they too have virtually 100% addiction, alcoholism. There's the natural experiment that needs to be done, and it has been done historically. You couldn't do that experiment now. It would be too cruel. You wouldn't want to do it.
So trying to apply a word to this, having a loss of purpose, a loss of meaning in one's life, a loss of identity, a loss of culture, what would be the most appropriate word to use that's being lost here?
I don't know that there's a single word for it. I tend to use the word dislocation, but I don't think my word's any better than anyone else's word. The fact is, I love Plato, Socrates. The fact is that we have known forever that people are complicated designs, and that we have all kinds of needs. We need to love somebody. We need to have a special skill. We need to have a reason to get up in the morning, a purpose. Somebody needs us to do something. We need to have a sense of who we are, a sense of meaning. We need to have some sense of who's in charge here. Maybe it's somebody up in heaven there that's in charge. Everyone needs that. And everywhere you find people, you find that the genius of culture, you find, is that culture allows us to satisfy most of those needs most of the time reasonably well. And that where you start truncating culture or abrogating culture, all of a sudden you can't satisfy most of those needs. And an addiction will do it for you, because an addiction is an invitation to fantasy, right? It is if you specialize so much on this that you drive everything else out of your mind, then this becomes everything. And you can see it. I mean, I spend my life really talking to addicted people, and they will tell you that. They will tell you, like I mentioned earlier, these guys that I met when I first met to Vancouver, and they're telling me this life that Batman thought was a junky existence and it was only about drugs is rich life. Like they get to do all kinds of things. They get to rob stores, and they get to tell stories with their other junkie criminal friends, and they get to hang out with hookers and all this exciting stuff. And it's not as good as a regular life, but it's the only life that is accessible to them. And so, of course, they won't give it up.
Mm-hmm.
They would rather die than give it up. And in fact, they do. They give up. They sacrifice their lives sometimes because they won't give it up. And it all makes sense, but I don't know how to explain it beyond that. I mean, you have to be there. You have to talk to these guys, and you have to examine your own life. I find I can examine my own life, and I can find those same patterns. Like there have been times in my life when I've been, like I'm a major work addict, when I've been so addicted to work that I was ignoring my children and my wife and being a bit of a jerk with my friends because I was in the laboratory all the time. Well, so I think we can understand addiction in this way. I think we can find it in our history books, like the history of Aboriginal people or the history of all kinds of people, I've done a lot of historical reading on this. This just keeps coming up over and over again.
I unfortunately like to oversimplify things. And as you mentioned before, that human beings, of course, are very complex and our lives are complicated. And this is going to be a ridiculous question, but I'm going to try it anyway. If there's a silver bullet to this situation of addiction, a change in how things operate in the world, what suggestions do you have for if you could just push a button and change things that you think would help improve the situation and really greatly reduce the amount of addiction that exists in our society?
There's no button. It's that simple. There's no button. The genius of culture is that culture evolves over time, and some cultures stay and flourish, and they are the ones that find a way to give people satisfaction around the clock in all these different aspects that people need. And the cultures which disappear are the cultures that don't. And so we have an evolutionary process. And so we can see, for example, in these Aboriginal cultures of British Columbia, where there's lots and lots of evidence about what they were like, they did pretty good at it. And they didn't have major addiction problems. They didn't have major problems with depression or ADHD or autism or these kinds of things which we find afflicting our children. They didn't have those problems. They did have other problems because they were people. People do fight wars, and people do take slaves, and people do commit crimes. They weren't superhuman, but they solved the addiction problem up until they got colonized. But what all the colonists did, the Canadian colonists, all they did was wreck their culture. They didn't massacre them and slaughter them. They just wrecked their culture. So if there's a button, I guess what we'd write on the button, the silver button that we press that solves this problem is cultural evolution, and that has kind of stopped right now. Like we're in a position where the world needs to come together, but the culture that's going to emerge is going to be a world culture, because we're all in contact. So can we make a culture of 8 billion people united by the internet that will actually work, that will actually function, so that most of us and most of our children and most of our grandchildren can find a viable, adequate life? Can we find that? We don't know. We haven't found it yet, but we may. And if you read what I think of as the contemporary philosophical literature, that's what people are searching for. They're searching for a kind of an adequate political science that will tell us how to organize the world so that people can be fulfilled as human beings reasonably. But we have no consensus on which direction to go. And we have we have no country which is showing us that even this can be done on a country level, unless it's Bhutan. But we have no modern culture which seems to fulfill this need for human beings. And that's where we are, I think, in world history, is we're perhaps on the cusp of an emerging world culture which will be adequate, and we're perhaps not. And if not, then we're going to continue to kill ourselves with addiction and climate change and nuclear war and economic crashes and political turmoil and social dysfunction, so that we can't have reasonable arguments and all this stuff. It's as if this is a critical moment in a unique way. I mean, there have been critical moments throughout history, of course, but this is a uniquely critical moment, because it's the moment where a world culture will emerge or not.
A question about personal responsibility in this, because something that you've mentioned on a number of occasions are these large-scale movements that impact people's lives to a degree where any sort of personal work somebody's going to do along the way is more than likely going to fall short, using colonization as an example. That when you have the dislocation that exists within the individual and the lack of connection to community and family and place and all these situations that arise, is there something that an individual can do in dire situations that can assist them in avoiding going down paths of addiction?
Sure. We can sense the danger. That's one thing, and we can sense that really you can get addicted to anything. You can get addicted to a drug or a gambling habit or a love relationship or a job or a dog or anything. We can recognize the danger, and we can know that the alternative is to find a fuller life, and that we can find that in collaboration with other people, and we can form organizations. This is why I like Pender Island. We form organizations, right? And we help each other. I think Pender is doing as well as any place that I can imagine in the world, in that we've got time, and we're comfortable enough economically so that we can take the time to form organizations and support each other, and we still have addiction problems. But what could we do beyond that? I don't think there is a magic bullet. I don't think there's a lever we can pull.
Yeah. I was just thinking about, is addiction related specifically to stress? That
Sure.
addiction is a reaction to stress?
Well, stress, of course, is a very broad word, but if you mean the stress of being disconnected from identity and meaning and purpose and stuff, sure, that's a stress. But you can stress people by simple poverty. That won't do it. I've had the good fortune to go to Fiji, to go to the outer islands of Fiji in a kayak. We didn't row across the Pacific, obviously, but we got there.
I'm glad you didn't try.
But I went on a trip where we visited villages in Fiji, and these are more or less traditional villages. The government of Fiji, in its wisdom, provides each village with a single fishing boat. And that means that the village, by using the fishing boat cooperatively, they get enough to eat. But beyond that, they don't have anything. Like, they talk about poverty, they don't have shoes, and they're living on a coral environment, which just cuts my feet to pieces. I can't walk on it. They walk all over the place with no shoes, and they don't have tables, so they eat on the floor on a grass mat. And when they have company, the company eats first, and then they another shift comes in to sit on the grass mat, and they have dinner. They don't have, of course, computer appliances and cell phones or any of that stuff. But in the evening, they go out and they play rugby, and Fiji produces world-class rugby teams, and they have a really good time. Oh, and they don't have doctors. The reason I was able to go on this tour is that we had doctors with us, and every village, as soon as we get there, the people would bring up their children and say, "Doctor, will you help me?" And the doctors would. That was our ticket of admission. But these people were so poor, they didn't have anything of what we have as a culture. They had nothing. Now, I don't know what their addiction statistics are, but they were just such happy, vibrant people. It was a pleasure to be there. And of course they had drugs. They would, as soon as we were there, they'd say, "Oh, tonight we have the kava ceremony," and we would all drink kava out of coconut shells. And kava is a pretty good drug. It's fine. And then they all go to bed, and nobody stays up all night and goes back to the hut and beats their wife. And so the point is, I think, that what's missing in an addicted person is not simply poverty. You can't solve it by going in there and giving them shoes or doctors. You've got to let their culture evolve by itself, and this is the wisdom of Fiji. They leave these people alone, and except that they give them a fishing boat and fuel, diesel fuel for the fishing boat, and they seem to do reasonably well. Now, can we do that for people like ourselves, people who have all these appliances already? I don't know what we would do. What would be the equivalent thing to do, except let people come to Pender Island and work it out, work out an island culture, which seems pretty good, and maybe as good as we can be in this world. I don't know, but maybe to really deal with the problem of addiction, we've got to deal with the world problems in the world level. Maybe we have to have an emerging world society, and maybe it has to be mediated by the internet, and maybe we have to find a way to make that work without having our children locked up in their bedrooms playing video games. We haven't done it yet, but I don't think there's a shortcut. I think that we are part of an evolutionary process, and we're going to get there or not.
I love it. I think it's great. I think to say that there's not a shortcut and it's part of a grander evolutionary process is fantastic. I was half joking when I said I like to look for simple solutions for things, because I realize that they don't necessarily exist, that anything worth solving or having is
sure. But we would all like a simple solution. If there could be one, I think we should jump for it, but I just can't see what it would be.
Are you optimistic about the future?
No. I would like to be optimistic. I'm not pessimistic either. I just think we're going to have to take it as it comes. But it's pretty scary right now, isn't it?
I think maybe I might not feel like it's as scary as other people for either being right or wrong about that. I don't know.
Good.
Yeah. For myself, I feel as if I try to really connect with nature, connect with people, try to really touch into what feels real. And the fear mongering that exists. There's awful things going on in the world right now. Just anywhere you turn, there's awful things. But I get the impression that our ability to hear about these things on such a frequency that didn't exist before, because when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, there was the 6 o'clock news. And the 6 o'clock news is not an accurate reflection of reality by any means, although it does report on things going on in local but mostly international situations. And that and the newspaper were your only two main sources of the horrible things that was going on in the world. And every time we turn on a computer screen, it's available for us to be told just how bad things are in order to hook our attention. And I wonder if the inundation of that information is really causing us to perceive things as being worse than what they really are. I don't know. When I look out the window or I go outside and I see the birds chirping and the deer walking around and the bugs doing their things and things growing in the garden, things look kind of okay, And so I guess it's just trying to reconcile those two realities and realize that what is actually true, what is truly going on. And of course, we're not living in a war-torn country that exists, and we're not living in some dire situation in an urban environment where there's a high murder rate or crime rate or things along those lines. So I guess the existence that we do have in this small island is not representative of the world on the whole, but I try to kind of focus on what is going on in my life and do my best to connect with that and connect with people in my life and lean on the side of love more than anything. And
well, I would just like to add something about you, which is, you are more than a person who just appreciates nature and appreciates society and so forth. You're an active creator of culture. You have created a cultural institute in these podcasts that didn't exist before, and which provides an opportunity for people, including myself, to hold forth, and people who wouldn't have that opportunity otherwise. In other words, you are creating meaning for us, and it's not like you alone are doing this. You're not Batman either, but you are part of a cultural creative process that matters in a big way, and perhaps that's a reason to be optimistic. And I will happily be optimistic with you, except I just can't get over thinking about the melting glaciers and so forth. I can't leave that out of my calculations. But my optimism is in the fact that my hope for optimism is in the fact that we really are creating. This is a creative time, and you're a very good example of it. And in that creation, I think we may get to a place where these problems are brought under control in a good way.
Well, that's a great word, creation. I've come to this conclusion quite recently, actually, that the amount of time spent creating versus the amount of time spent consuming, and the difference between those two amounts has a direct impact on what I believe my quality of life is. I love reading books. I enjoy watching TV shows, watching hockey. I'm a big consumer. But when the scale gets tipped so heavily in one side that I'm spending 95% of my time consuming versus 5% creating, my life feels so out of balance. And I think it's just so important for me. And I don't know, the more years I have on this planet, I tend to think that I'm like a lot of other people, and a lot of other people are like me, that we're quite similar in far more ways than not. But I think if we can really invest in our creativity and put more time into that and less time into consumption, then I think that there's more happiness to be found within that.
Well, I agree with that completely. And the dark side of that is that a lot of consuming is sort of created by advertising, which is telling us falsely that if we just have a Pepsi or whatever, we'll be vibrant and full of life and full of completeness, and running across the field with our hair blowing in the breeze. That's the dark side, that that we have created a culture which provides the illusion of some kind of completeness if we only consume enough of this or that. And I think that we need to control that. We need to not waste our time and our resources by doing that. And that means we need to control the psychologists who are writing those advertisements and planning those campaigns to get us to overconsume.
Yeah, I used to be so angry about stuff like that. It used to really irritate me. And when my wife and I were looking at moving to the island here, one of the things that stood out was, yes, there's no billboards on this island. I don't have to be advertised at with like McDonald's and Coca-Cola and all this stuff. And it was such a joy. But I can remember for so long, I was so mad about the advertisements constantly hurling at us. And it's even more now online, but I feel as if I've let go of that anger and channeling that energy into something more productive.
Yeah.
And that feels so much better.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. But I think we're going to wind this down, Bruce.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We've covered a lot of ground, but we're not coming to a hard stop here. But I just want to ask, first off, maybe, we've just touched on Pender just a little bit here, but what has living on Pender Island meant to you?
Well, that brings up the question of why am I on Pender, which is I'm on the Pender Island almost by accident. My wife, my wonderful wife, lived with me in East Vancouver for the last 20 years, and she absolutely didn't want to because she's a country girl, and I'm a city boy, so it's very natural for me to live in East Vancouver and work in the downtown east side, but she lived in East Vancouver graciously, and she changed our 33-foot lot from a lawn into a national park practically. She has all these trees growing and benches, and you should see our house. But that isn't where she wanted to live, and so when I retired, she said, "Let's go live on Pender," and I said, "Okay, that's fair." And so here I am, and I never heard of Pender really, except I knew it was out the window when you go to Victoria on the ferry. And I love it here. I didn't know what I was getting into, but what I find is a society of people, and a lot of older people, which is good for me because I'm pretty ancient. And what I find is a society of creative older people, and you're a creative younger person, but there's a lot of creative older people who are getting together and making life pretty good. And I figure this is the right kind of experiment, and the right kind of results are coming out of it. Not to overpraise Pender, because I could criticize it too, but I don't particularly feel like it. I'd rather focus on the fact that we do a lot of things right here. So I'm liking it here.
Yeah. It is a pretty good place. It is a pretty good place. I have people ask me from time to time, "Oh, you live here. How do you like living here? You must love it." And I have to pause and think about it. And I think, yeah, I do love it. But it's again, it's a complicated experience being here. But it's generally one that is very great to be able to live in this beautiful place and also in this beautiful community.
Yeah, and I would second that. That's how I feel too.
Well, let's bring this on home. How would you like to end this interview off? Is there anything else that you want to say or add?
Yes, I would like to say thank you very much for this interview, and I think you have succeeded in allowing me or facilitating me saying the things which are really important to me, and I thank you for that.
Thank you so much to Bruce for doing that interview. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with him about this. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I learned a lot during that interview. So thank you for sticking around and listening to the whole episode. If you find yourself here listening to my words right now, I appreciate people doing that. I'd like to say thank you to Ben McConkey for providing the theme music to this podcast. And once again, if you're at all interested in recording your own life stories, your audio memoir, you can reach out to me through my website, myaudiomemoir.com, and perhaps I can help you put together a pretty fantastic telling of your life story for your family to enjoy. Take care, everyone out there. Until next time.